Welcome everybody to this episode of the Tabletop Battlefield Live. I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield, and tonight we're moving on to the third episode here of painting up Cypher, Lord of the Fallen. This is the Games Workshop miniature that was released about 6 months ago, along with the Triumphant of the Primarch, alongside Reboot Gulliman and that librarian from the Grey Knights, whose name I have no freaking clue what it is, because I bought the box set just for Cypher here. I'm not sure how many episodes this series is going to go on for. Painting Kairos Fate Weaver went on for about 14 episodes, and I did a lot of, though with that guy I did a lot of work off camera, whereas I have not done anything off camera yet with Cypher. I've just been painting him only live on this show, because he's obviously a much smaller miniature, a lot less to paint. I don't need to quite do as much work off camera. So we're going to continue tonight with the cape, and probably really only get through painting the cape tonight. I'll see. We might move on maybe some of the guns, something like that, but mainly tonight I'm working on getting the cape done. So I got the proper colors and all that kind of stuff. And I did have to buy a new artificial layer extra small brush. My other one, the bristles all finally fell out. Fantastic brush, and I highly recommend it. So that's why I bought another one. They're really expensive, but they're amazing brushes. And go along with painting Cypher tonight, I want to talk about a topic that I've been getting a lot into recently, and that's 3D printing. So I want to do my state of 3D printing for tabletop gaming for 2017. I gave a presentation on 3D printing related to tabletop gaming several years ago at a local technology conference, and I wanted to kind of update what has happened since then and how things are changing, and if tabletop gaming is really threatened or altered in any way by 3D printing yet. Short answer, not exactly yet, but you know, that's the way it's been for the past 5-10 years now, so we'll see what happens. But let's go ahead and dive in here to painting not Kairos Fate Weaver, that was the old series, painting Cypher. Alright, so last time I started applying some white paint in a couple thin layers to his cloak. I'm going to finish that up right now, tonight. This time though, I'm going to try to remember to actually let the layers dry in between painting layers. Last time I was talking so much about Rune Wars versus Warhammer Fantasy, I kind of was just pushing paint around by the end of the show. So let's not do that this time and actually apply an amount of paint. So wet palette's coming out here. I'm going to use my larger Winsor Newton Series 7 brush to get the basic colors down. The artificial layer brush, that's going to use it more for detail later on. This is a very large scale, of course, you know, large scale being relative, being a miniature, application of color, so that's why I'm only going to work with my Winsor Newton Series 7 brush, which is a lot larger, once again, very relative terminology, because it's a tabletop gaming miniatures, but a lot larger compared to the artificial layer extra small brush. But they're essentially the same, very similar types of brushes. The Winsor Newton Series 7 brushes are incredibly high quality brushes. Alright, so let's dive into talking about the 3D printing update for 2017 and how 3D printing relates to tabletop gaming at this point in its lifespan. So of course, as a very general rule, 3D printing is the process of taking a computer model, a computer generated model, and turning it into a real physical object through some process, some additive process. What that means is you're not like taking a block of material and cutting something out. You're just taking raw material and essentially gluing it together such that it forms a solid object. So that's different than, say, like a CNC mill machine, which would take a block of aluminum or a block of steel and kind of grind it down to the shape of something else. So 3D printing is basically the opposite of that. Now, in regards to 3D printing as it stands now, you've got the two existing technologies that have been in the home for a while now. You have FDM, that is fused deposition modeling. When you think of 3D printers, you're probably thinking of one of these types of printers. The vast majority of printers out there, in fact I think all but like one at the moment, is this type of technology. A fused deposition modeling is where you have a nozzle that's ejecting superheated plastic out one very tiny layer at a time, and it's essentially building up the miniature from the ground up, like really tiny layers. So, and it just adds, you know, it basically takes a 3D model, breaks it down in these tiny little layers, and adds them one at a time, building from the ground up. I think I said that about 3 times right there, saying the exact same phrasing. But you know what I'm talking about. This is This is the kind of printer I have. I recently purchased an Ultimaker printer. That's one of the more, I guess, quote, boutique, more expensive. Let's say more expensive brands. That's the more appropriate terminology of 3D printing technology. But all in all, these printers are getting a lot better, and they're getting cheaper. There are some FDM printers that are under $300. You know, I don't know how good said cheap printers are. Good's a very relative terminology when it comes to 3D printing, I find out. My idea of good is a lot higher standard than your typical hobbyist, mainly because, you know, I'm coming from a tabletop game background. In particular, you know, I have my Caladagia line of miniatures, and those greens for the Caladagia miniatures are all manufactured using a 3D printing process. So naturally, I have a much higher standard for what I consider good than probably what a lot of people do. A lot of people have like this Yoda bust from, you know, the character from Star Wars. It's like kind of goofy looking. Granted, it's kind of a goofy looking character, but you know, it's a little bit not great detail. You see lots of nice, well-defined layer lines, and they're like, "This is amazing," and I'm like, "No, it's not. That's garbage." But once again, that's just a different perspective. But so, the biggest problem I've had with FDM printers, and why I actually finally bought one, why I changed my mind, is they used to have very visible layer lines. You know, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the material is laid down one layer at a time, and they were kind of big layers. You know, you think of a layer as 0.4 millimeters thick. That's obviously very tiny if you were to look at a ruler, but it's big enough to where you notice it when you're looking at the miniature. And oftentimes there'd be a little bit of inaccuracy with each layer. And I'm talking very, very tiny amounts of inaccuracy, but you can see them in the final miniature. Oh, by the way, I'm using linen white on the outside of his cape. This is a Reaper paint, and it's a slightly off-color white. So I'm just applying multiple thin layers of that. I just realized I didn't mention what color of material or white I was using on the on his cape here. I just started blabbering about, oh, crap. One moment, I just got paint off his arm. Brush fail. I kind of was just brushing a little too overzealous, and I got a little bit of paint on his armor that I had finished painting earlier. But that's alright, I just cleaned it up. We're good to go. I never painted that piece, did I? He's got a little shoulder pauldron. I didn't paint the armor color, so I'll have to go back and do that later. Now I lost train of thought. Okay, so yeah. The FDM printers used to have really huge, very noticeable layer lines. And it just didn't look very good. But they're getting a lot better. So the Ultimaker 2 Go is the one that I purchased. It's the cheapest of the Ultimaker 2 line. I think it's the cheapest of all the Ultimakers. I think they might still sell the original Ultimaker. So it's the cheapest of the original of the Ultimaker 2 line. It's the smallest one. It's only got about a 4" by 4" by 4" build area. But I purchased it, one, because it's small. It's physically maybe a little bit more than a cubic foot in size. And I live in an apartment, so small size stuff is good like that. Plus, it's very, very quiet. It's approximately 50 decibels when in operation, which, you know, comparison-wise, a old crummy dishwasher, what I have here in the apartment, is about 80 decibels, which is quite a bit louder. It's not like the decibel scale is like logarithmic, so I think that might be like 100 times louder, something like that. I forget the math in my head. But the point is, it's very, very quiet. Not all 3D printers are that quiet. Some can be very, very loud. So that's why one thing you have to look into if you're looking at choosing an FDM printer is get an idea of just how loud they're going to be, if that matters to you. I mean, I've heard people complain about they can hear them violently shaking from all the way in the basement. Most of the more expensive ones are going to be fairly quiet. I've seen some videos of the Lulzbot. Yeah, the Lulzbot Taz, which is their really expensive one. And there was two people talking in front of that thing, recording a video while it was going, and you could barely hear it in the background. So just be advised, that's one of the features you tend to get on some of the more expensive printers, is they're a lot quieter. The other reason why I went with a more expensive printer, I haven't tried, now it's very important to note, I haven't tried any of the really cheap ones, the sub $500 ones. I've seen them. Micro Center, which is a computer store, does sell cheap 3D printers. But from what I was told and what I've seen so far with my observations of using the Ultimaker, which by the way, this guy I was showing earlier here, this Spire was made with the Ultimaker. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. They have a much higher mechanical tolerance. So they shake less, and they have a significantly more accurate positioning of the nozzles. I mean, it's funny when you think about shake less. The things all in general barely shake at all. But when you're dealing with resolutions that are sub-millimeter, a little bit of vibration can really affect model quality. The Ultimaker 2 Go doesn't vibrate at all. It's completely unnoticeable. It gets very, very good precision on things. And most 3D printers are relatively low maintenance. I got to put some oil on every now and then. And fiddling with the PLA filament, that's the rolls of plastic that you feed into the machine. There's a little bit of fiddling there, but that's with any PLA printer. But those are the two main things you generally going to get with a more expensive printer, is that you get quieter operation as well as super high precise operation. In terms of the layer height, this is where the biggest improvement has been to these FDM printers. The Ultimaker, I haven't tried going down to this level yet, but the Ultimaker 2 Go can have a smallest layer height of 0.6 millimeters. What I'm going to do is to figure out just how good that really is. I'm going to go ahead at some point in the not too distant future when I'm done with my current 3D printing project and the next one, because I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But I'm going to go ahead and print out some of my Caladagium miniatures and compare those on the Ultimaker to see how they look when stacked up next to the very high-end, very expensive 3D printers that Shapeways has, because I get all my current greens manufactured at Shapeways. I fully expect the Shapeways machines to be a lot better, but I'm kind of curious to see just how close you can get to a professional grade miniature and how long it takes to print a professional grade miniature. So that'll be something I'm going to try in the future. But like the thing I just showed you there, it's an Egyptian sandstone themed spire, because I'm building an arena for Arena Rex. That's a game of gladiatorial combat, kind of an alternative history type game where the Roman Empire, something happened. I want to say Julius Caesar was killed before his conquering of Gaul or something like that. I don't really know this full story behind it. But the idea is the Roman Empire never fell, and they continued to expand, and because of that, there's gladiatorial combat all over the world. And this guy here, this is a layer height of 0.2 millimeters, which now that it's primed and painted, and you're looking at it, especially with the camera, you can barely tell that there's layers there. When I'm looking at it here with my own eyes, I can still see a little bit of layers, because the layers do catch the light just a tiny little bit. Not much, but just a little bit. You still can kind of see them. But when you're looking like a foot or so away, I'm right now about maybe 18 inches, 2 feet away from that thing looking at it, I can't tell that it's 3D printed, or barely tell that it's 3D printed. This terrain for these FDM printers terrain production for FDM printers is getting really, really good. That thing you see right there takes about 5.5 hours to print at a 0.2 millimeter layer resolution. Now I could increase the resolution to 0.1 millimeters, but of course that's going to probably double, get pretty darn close to doubling the print time, because you double the layer resolution, it's got to now make twice as many layers, so therefore it probably will get pretty darn close to doubling the print time. 3D printing in general doesn't really have any economy of scale. So making 2 items is essentially pretty darn close to 2 times the time it would take to make 1 item. That's more of a business discussion, business and money discussion, and sometime I'll probably talk about that. So there's some more details in addition to what I'm going to do in that terrain, other than simply just make it for my own purposes. I do plan on selling 3D printer related stuff in not too far in the future. But more info on that coming in a few weeks when I kind of figure out exactly what I'm going to be doing here. So now I'm working on Cypher here on the front of his front cloak. He has like 2 strands of material that kind of come down in front of his body. And I'm applying the same linen white, off-white color to those 2 strands while I let the other layers of paint on the back of his cloak dry. So let's talk about the next type of printing that's currently available in the home. Sla Printing. This is stereolithography. This isn't anything quite new in terms of it being available for the home. And I should mention, all this technology I'm talking about here is not new, period. 3D printing has been around for more than 20, probably 30, 40 years at this point, maybe somewhere in 30 and 40. It's just that it's never been available to the home user until really maybe starting 10 years ago. Shapeways showed up sometime prior to 2010. Because I remember I stumbled across them when I was launching Caladasia. And, from the very beginning, I was thinking these guys would probably be something good for making miniatures. And so they've been around somewhere pre-2010. I don't know exactly when they showed up. But they were, a major important step forward. And all around that time is when all these 3D printers really started appearing. But Sla Printing, most famous by the company Formlabs, and they originally had their Form 1 printer, which was a Kickstarter, and then it was available for sale. I want to say the company had some legal issues they were getting with patents or something. I don't know. I shouldn't say that. I know I'm pretty sure they're having some legal issues, and that's why I kind of figured the company was kind of done for. But they came out. They must have got those issues resolved. I'm not sure how that particular case ended up, if it was some sort of license agreement or something like that. But they eventually released the Form 2 printer. I don't have this one, and I have not used this one, but I've watched some videos of this thing, and this thing is freaking cool. And it's definitely probably the next printer I would want to buy. Sla Printing, in some ways, is kind of the opposite of FDM printing. Where FDM printing, you're kind of adding layers of material. Sla Printing uses some sort of container of resin. So you've got a little bucket of resin, essentially, sitting on top of the printer. And there's the use of high-precision lasers, which cure the resin one tiny bit at a time. It still works in layers, so it builds it up layer by layer, but instead of adding material, like where it's spurts it out of a nozzle, what it's doing is it's just kind of solidifying material that's already in place. And this allows for significantly higher amounts of detail than what FDM printers can do. It's kind of like, comparison-wise, you can think of a FDM printer as almost being like a Sharpie marker, and these kind of guys as being like a very fine tip Sharpie marker. You can see how, if you compare those two types of markers together, you can get a lot more precision and a lot more detail with a very fine tip marker compared to a much fatter tip marker. That being said, the Formlabs 2 printer is strongly recommended that you use their resin, and they have their system set up where you buy the components from them. I believe it can use third-party components, but it's one of those things where it's strongly not recommended for one reason or another. It's also very expensive. It's about $3,500 is the start of the system. The resin starts costing at $140 for a liter. I don't know how much that works out to be, but I'm going to go ahead and probably make the safe assumption that even though this printer may be able to compete with like Games Workshop in quality, it may. I don't know if it can. I never seen any of the prints really up close and personal, but they look very, very good from what I've been seeing people doing reviews on YouTube. It may be able to compete with tabletop quality. Very, very close. But I'm almost certain that just because it can compete in quality, it's probably not any cheaper to manufacture them, and in likelihood it's probably more expensive to manufacture a miniature using this particular printer than it is just to go ahead and buy the miniature from Games Workshop. Right? Especially with your large miniatures as well as your rank and file troops. Guys like Cypher here, which if he was sold individually, he might be $20, $25. That's probably safe to say that's cheaper, maybe. But, you know, that's just kind of my estimate. But I do want to get this 3D printer. I could really seeing it being very valuable for Caladagia. If it can produce results very similar to what Shapeways gets right now, I'd love to be able to produce those greens in-house. In the long term, it'd be cheaper. I may even produce like small miniatures, like my fighter miniatures, in-house using that printer, because those are really tiny and really cheap. So there's definitely a serious interest in myself to go ahead and purchase that printer. So I'll let you know if I ever do. It's a little steep, $3,500 is a little steep. And, you know, being in an apartment, it's kind of messy to have something like that with all the liquid resin sitting around. Though it does use a cartridge system, which looks pretty nice. I think that, you know, the cartridge system will help keep that mess in check, but, you know, it's not going to be perfect. Whereas an FDM printer, there's no mess at all really to that. You might get a little bit of filament getting around here, but the filament is solid. You just pick it up and throw it out. PLA is biodegradable, so it's a lot less messiness for a PLA printer than there is for the SLA printers. But, you know, I'll let you know sometime, guys, if I do end up buying that printer. If I do, it's going to be a next year kind of a thing when I get some more money saved up. But that could be a fun 2018 3D printing update topic, talking about the Form 2 printer. Or I might just wait until the Form 3 comes out, because I'm sure that'll be out in a few years. Because I don't know, the Form 2's been out for a little while. I think it was I want to say last year maybe, or maybe it might have been 2 years ago. Alright, well the back of this cloak is looking pretty good in terms of its base colors. We'll get back to that in a minute and start applying some shading to it. So the other type of technology you're going to start hearing about for the hobbyist market, and this is something, it's like, yeah, I mean, technically hobbyist market, I suppose, very high-end hobbyist market, is SLS printing. Once again, this has been around for a while. Shapeways has had this type of printing available for a long time. This is more or less like their white and strong flexible plastic, or white and strong and flexible plastic, or whatever it's called. And this is, let's see, selective laser sintering. So I believe, once again, I believe this uses lasers, hence why lasers in the name. But unlike SLA printing, where it is a liquid resin that's getting solidified, SLS printing uses some sort of dust or particle-like material that then gets solidified by the lasers. So it's a little bit of a different process, and you get a different feel to it. I have gotten some of these materials from Shapeways. Some of the earliest Caladagia miniatures were in this material. It has a very distinctive, noticeable texture to it. You can feel it, and when you paint it up, you can see it a little bit. Because of the fact that it's something that's basically built from dust, you do see a very fine, bumpy texture all over the miniature, or whatever you're making. This particular printer is being made by Form Labs, the same guys who make the Form 2 printer. This is and why I say a high-end hobbyist market is, this printer system starts at $10,000 and has a $20,000 version that's complete kit in terms of like refilling, materials, cleaning, stuff like that. So you really would want to buy the full $20,000 kit, or at least get, you know, one $20,000 kit and then maybe add on a couple $10,000 printers. So given those prices, you're probably not going to see many hobbyists start to use that. That being all said, though, what was I going to say here? Hobbyist not going to be using it. Oh, that means it's somewhere in the range, according to Forum Labs anyway, of about 1/10 the cost of existing SLS systems. So even though, you know, $10,000, $20,000 seems ridiculously expensive, that's a huge price drop, which means you're going to see this technology become even cheaper, and it's going to become even more widely available. You might start seeing, once again, this is a big might, because I know there's some stores in my area have talked about it, gaming stores and printing stores actually getting 3D printers and start, selling that as a service. Because, I could see a local gaming store, if the person wants to be able to have a sort of a market for producing 3D printed terrain. Depending on how things are going, there's not a huge markup for that, mainly because things take a long time. But once again, that's more of a business discussion. I will have that with you guys later as I figure out a lot of the details of the business side of producing and selling 3D prints and 3D models and things like that. But I think with a $20,000 system, you're going to start seeing that thing show up in more local stores and local facilities, and that's going to become a much more reasonably accessible, relatively high quality 3D printing thing. I personally don't like it for tabletop gaming. Like I said, that weird texture doesn't look very good. It doesn't make miniatures look very good. You can see it just doesn't look right. So I don't think that particular technology will have a huge impact on the tabletop game market. It doesn't have any huge advantages because of that texture thing over what FDM printing can do right now, and FDM printing is a heck of a lot cheaper. So I mentioned a few times about Shapeways. Obviously, Shapeways is the company where you send, I keep saying, obviously is one of those words I say a lot. Kind of like how back in that one episode of the Tabletop Battlefield I said so like 163 times. I think obviously it's become a new favorite word, which is kind of obnoxious, isn't it? So Shapeways is a service where you can upload your 3D models and then have it printed out in a variety of different materials. That's what I use, like I said, for the Caladagia miniatures. And what they have, it's a technology that's certainly not home 3D printing, but it's kind of interesting to know about. The highest quality stuff that I use is MJM. Oh, I didn't write down what that stands for. Darn it. But it's multi-jet manufacturing or something like that. It's sort of like FDM on steroids, and I'm sure someone's probably going to yell at me and thinking, no, that's not what it is at all. But it's ejecting a resin out of tiny, tiny nozzles. Like the Ultimaker 4 printer I have right now, the nozzle diameter is 0.4 millimeters. These nozzles sound like you're getting on maybe even the scale of MEMS technology, which is sub-micrometer level, like, you're talking like 1/1,000,000th-ish of like a meter kind of a thing. So you're getting down to really tiny, tiny nozzle sizes and really just as tiny layer sizes. So it's still kind of like an FDM printer where it builds it up one layer at a time, but the resolution is so small and so precise you can barely see any of the layer lines and wobbliness that would normally come from using an FDM printer. I don't think this particular technology is going to be showing up in the home anytime soon. These printers are still ridiculously expensive, but I'll talk more about what's going on, why 3D printing technology is still not super accessible at this point. It's getting better, but it's still not there yet. So those are the main different types of 3D printing technology that's out there. Nothing's really new, but they're all getting better and they're all getting cheaper. So slowly, bit by bit, this stuff is becoming more accessible to a home audience, but it's still going to be a long time. So where does all this technology fit into the gaming world? Let's kind of go through each of those different types of 3D printing, and I'll comment on where I think at this point, technology-wise, where those different types of 3D printing really fit into the tabletop gaming market. But I'll talk about that here in just a minute. I'm going to move on. Well, I'm going to keep working on... Oh, crap. I put my finger on the front of Cypher's cloak, and I kind of ruined a little bit of the white paint there, so let me just fix that quickly. But I'm going to go back and forth between finishing up the white cloaks on his side of his arm. This is the extra piece I have sitting over here, as well as what's on the front here. I'm going to be finishing those up. Probably got a whole bunch of more layers to go. I think I watered down this paint a little too much, so I'm going to have a lot of more thin layers to go on the front here, to be honest with you. But I'm also going to start working on the back here. And what I'm going to do is start adding some shadow to the whole cloak. I may give the whole entire cloak a very small wash with the Seraphim Sepia, Seraphim Sepia, there we go. This is the brown wash, a kind of a light brown wash from Games Workshop's line of washes. I'm going to probably, no, I kind of like the white cloak, so I'm not going to put it all over the place, but I'm going to work this into some of the shadow areas, so these in between the creases here, put a little bit down in there, just to make it look like the cloak is essentially cloaked in shadow, because it'd be a little bit of a darkerish brown color in the shadow areas there. And there's also plenty of places where it's torn a little bit. I'll probably put a little bit of the color around those torn areas too. How I like to work with the shade, so you shake up the bottle a little bit and you get a little bit of the shade here on the lip of the cap. Even that amount of dipping your brush in that amount of shade right there is really a lot. So what I then do is I run my brush along the very side of the top of the lip of the cap here. So a lot of the wash then kind of runs off my brush and goes down into this little pool in the actual lip of the cap. So that way I get a very tiny amount of the wash on my brush, and then I can start very quickly working that into the model where I want it to be. Because when you're working on a white surface like this, too much wash can ruin things very, very fast. And you can always go back and add a little bit more, thin layers of white. If you do kind of screw things up a little bit, it's not the end of the world. Especially if you're adding really thin layers of white, you kind of can counteract the effect of the wash just a little bit. So let's talk about, as I do this here, let's talk about where 3D printing is really fitting into the world of tabletop gaming. The FDM printers, as I mentioned before, are getting really pretty good at making certain types of terrain. Castle walls, rock formations, bridges, large physical structures. These are things that the FDM printers can work really well at. Like, I was mentioning as making my Arena Rex. It's kind of unfortunate that the thing you built is in the name of the game. So I've got these 4 kind of sandstone-like spires that I designed in Blender, and then I'm printing those out. Those are going to be obstacles within the arena, so they're going to just look kind of cool inside the arena. And then I'm also the entire wall, so it's going to be about a 23-inch diameter arena. And where are they? Here they are. And I'm 3D printing an entire wall that's going to go around it. There's been a lot of fiddling with this to get things right, to get the brick sizes right, and stuff like that. But this is going to end up being a really cool textured sandstone wall. And one of the things I did to help hide the layer lines a little bit is, if you bring this guy back over here to the camera, there's a bumpy texture on the rocks. I did that intentionally to not only give, like kind of a fake sandstone texture to it, but it also kind of roughens up the edges of the blocks like they're chiseled out of rock, and they kind of look a little bit closer to what the pictures of like Egyptian walls that I found would be, instead of just having nice clean mass manufactured bricks. But also that bumpy texture does a pretty good job of helping to hide some of the layer lines. Not completely, you can still see the layer lines, but the texture does hide it a little bit. Though, let me show you this one thing here. The texture can get a little bit screwy depending on what you're doing. Of course, if you look from the side of the wall, you're building up one layer at a time. The texture that sticks out kind of along the print layers, those actually look pretty good. But they're also, the top of the bricks have that weird bumpy texture to them also. But things didn't work quite right. The printer can't quite make a bumpy texture layer by layer, so you get this weird arrow thing going on. You see in a couple of those bricks there. I don't really know how to fix that at the moment, but so it's important, just to note that 3D printers can print certain textures in certain directions and certain orientations a lot better than they can in other ways. So it's one of those things you got to think about when you're planning out your FDM models. But this guy, I'm going to go ahead and make a whole bunch of more terrain for it beyond, the Arena Rex thing. I'm making my Halloween costume. I'm using a lot of 3D printing for that. So that's going to be kind of what my 3D printer's tied up in through October-ish. I know I'm going to probably make some 15mm American Revolution and American Civil War style buildings. Those are kind of hard to find in the United States, oddly enough. So I got a whole bunch of, I'll take look at some pictures from my Civil War books over here and use those as references to make terrain kits. And those are the things I can probably sell. Not only just the 3D models, but even selling some of the actual 3D prints. Though, you just can't make a lot of 3D printed stuff without having a lot of printers. So once it goes back to, there's no economy of scale there. So that's basically where FDM printers are going to fit in right now, is these larger structure terrain elements. Smaller structure things, there gets to a point where they're not as good. So thin rods, thin columns, kind of like maybe a crane-like lattice structure, you can probably print that reasonably well if you print it flat and assemble it together. But if you try to print those kind of structures all together, like as one piece, the thin layer, like the thin rods being built up, those can look really messy in certain printers. So there are limits to what these FDM printers can do in terms of printing in one piece, but I think if you were to print them flat and then glue 4 sides together, they would probably work pretty well. I'm definitely gonna experiment with that. So there are limits to what you can do. They're not miracle devices yet. When it comes to the SLA printers, like the Form Labs, I think that's going to mostly be a rapid prototyping procedure. It's probably still too expensive to try to produce your own miniatures, and even then, there's still a very much a skill base required for 3D printing. 3D printing is still not easy by any means yet, and regardless of what printer technology you're planning to use. That being said, in terms of 3D printing for making miniatures, it's coming along. I was looking at Shapeways. They have tons and tons of miniatures that are available for sale in Shapeways. And there are certain categories of miniatures where they're starting to get cheaper than actually manufactured miniatures. I was looking at 1/3000th World War II naval warships. I know that's a very tiny miniatures, and definitely if gaming in general is a niche market, and Forge World is a niche market, 1/3000th tiny World War II warships is a niche market, but the fact is, you've now got an actual legitimate tabletop gaming miniatures market where the prices of the miniatures are comparable or cheaper than the traditional pewter miniatures that these gamers buy. And this is a big deal, because 3D printing means it's finally getting to the point in certain circumstances where it can compete with actual traditionally manufactured miniatures. I think it's got a very long way to go for things like Warhammer 28mm scale stuff. And I can tell you that it's far cheaper to buy the Caladagian miniatures, the final production miniatures, from me than it is to get them from Shapeways. It's significantly more expensive from Shapeways than to get them from me. So we're not there yet. There are some other 28mm scale miniatures. They don't have actual pictures of the final product. They just have 3D renderings. So there was a 3-pack of Napoleon Bonaparte, basically him standing, one sitting, and one like him doing a pose for a photograph kind of a pose. There's a pack of 3 of those at 28mm going for $18, which is not a bad price. There were some 35mm miniatures that supposedly were going for around $20-ish for the very high quality plastics, which would kind of put those price-wise comparison with Arena Rex. But those are all just kind of 3D models that don't have actual pictures to go with them, so I'm not 100% sure just how good they would be. But you're starting to see that price point come down a little bit. So let's talk about what's holding 3D printing back. And the first thing, and I want to imply that this is necessarily holding them back, but this is a limiting factor for the home market, and that's patents. 3D printing, I said, is not a new technology, and there are still a lot of patents that are on some of these really, really amazing 3D printing systems. And because of that, they're not available to the home user yet. So eventually, all this really cool stuff, the SLA printing, the MJM printing, all that stuff is going to end up in the home market eventually. But like a lot of it has some patents to it, and those patents are protected by companies with very rich pocketbooks, and they're willing to to defend them. So until those things expire, you're not going to see that kind of stuff very often in the home market. But then again, I really don't think that's the biggest issue, though. 3D printing, like I just mentioned a minute ago, it's still not easy. And there's a couple of reasons. There's actually a number of reasons for this. You really need 3D modeling experience. So I mean, I've got almost at this point 20 years of sort of visual effects-ish experience. That's kind of me being fancy about saying that I know how to do 3D modeling. So you really need to know 3D modeling, and even mold making helps. Because mold making, there's a certain spatial reasoning to it to understand how things sit in the mold and how you need to build the mold. And some of those principles apply to 3D printing too, because of the concept of supports. Support is material that is added to the 3D print so that it can actually be printed. Like you can imagine, for example, let me hold this little piece. I've got this piece of Cypher that's his left arm and the cloak. If you were imagining you were printing this up from the ground up one layer at a time and start printing the cloak, but eventually you'd reach his arm, and there's no material below his arm, right? So what would happen there is it would try to print the material, and then it would just fall down because there's nothing supporting the arm. So that's why you need to use support materials that can hold those pieces, the finished pieces of the models up before those areas are printed. You need some sort of support to hold that arm piece up so it doesn't just fall off and crash into the ground. So that is not something that's easy to do. 3D printing programs are getting pretty good at doing that, but still sometimes it helps to be able to know how to add your own, know how to orient your model to minimize the waste of material. It still is gonna be a while. It's not super intuitive yet. They're getting there though. And the other thing what makes this really difficult to use is there's really tons of 3D printers out there. And that's a good thing from a market choice perspective. But what tends to happen is you don't actually get a file for your 3D printer, the file that it uses. The Ultimaker uses something called G-code, and I think a lot of printers use G-code. G-code is the actual instruction set on how to move the nozzle and how to extrude the material, how to set certain temperatures, how to turn certain features of the printer on. And that is something that is very specific. That file is very specific to the printer because it also has to factor in certain attributes of the printer, like how much material can be extruded out at a time, how fast it can print, how fast you can move the nozzle of the printer. There's a lot of details there that get stored in that file that are unique to that printer. So unless you can find somebody who's already generated a G-code file for your particular model, for your particular printer, what you get is called an STL file. That's almost always what you get. STL files are the 3D model itself. So you have to know how to take that STL file and make it work for your 3D printer. And that's not super easy yet. It's getting better. And it's a lot of people can help you with that. You can go on forums and learn stuff. But that still really helps to have 3D modeling knowledge to be able to work with those STL files. So that's one of those things that's still kind of holding things back a little bit. If one company were to kind of really take over the market, like an Ultimaker is a pretty well-known brand. They're in a lot of places, but a lot of people, there's like an i3 printer it's called. I want to say like Persila or something like that. It's another very popular one. If there was to be some sort of market dominance with a certain printer brand, you'd probably start seeing it become more accessible because then people would be more likely to share a particular G-code for a particular printer, knowing that a sizable portion of the audience can actually use that. But for the time being, that's still not the case. So along those details with the 3D models, there's still a lot of detailing and screwing around with the filament. The filament is, like I mentioned before, that's the material that you feed into the 3D printer, and it comes on these giant spools. For at least for the PLA, for the FDM printers, they come on giant spools. So you're basically buying a giant spool of plastic wire, and there's different types of PLA out there. There's different they melt at different temperatures, have different requirements. There's different types of materials, PLAs versus ABSs, and what they're used for, how to print them. So there's a lot of fiddly details, even just to choosing materials and how to work with them and setting the tensions right. Because you have a little feeder device that pulls those things into your printer, and there's got to be a tension in that feeder device that can grip the filament and pull it up into the printer, but not pull it up or not grip it so tight to where it deforms the filament and jams your printer. And expensive filaments work differently than cheap filaments. My Ultimaker came with a spool of the really expensive Ultimaker filament, which is fantastic stuff, but it's very expensive. I went ahead and I tried Inland filament. That is Micro Center's brand. That is the direct opposite. That stuff is dirt cheap, and I didn't have a lot of good luck with it, but it could have just been my printer was not quite tensioned right, so it would grab the filament, smush it a little bit, and jam up pretty quickly, so I kind of gave up on that. I just purchased some middle-of-the-road stuff called Melta Ink or something like that, Melt Ink PLA, and I think there should be a print sitting in my printer right now that's finished, and it was doing really good. So that was a nice, about half the price of the Ultimaker filament, but you got more of it, and I think it worked pretty well. I'm going to try it for a little bit more larger, a little bit more audacious print and see how things go. But as long as it didn't explode in the last 20 minutes of the print, it was looking really good before I started the show here. So that's a whole nother set of fiddly details and things. So, is there going to be anything really big and new on the horizon? No, not really. Not right at the moment. So a lot of what you see now it's gonna be that way probably for a few years. There are other SLA branded printers in development. There was a Kickstarter for one a while ago that actually had a working printer. There was that Kickstarter for that phone one where it used your phone to be an SLA printer. That one has not been released. I was looking into that a while ago, and a good thing I did not back that one. There's a lot of angry backers on that one. Will it ever be released? I have no idea. It may, maybe not. Time will tell how that thing ends up. But SLA technology is going to start becoming more common. If there are any patent issues around that, you're going to start seeing a lot of lawsuits come out. So it'll be an interesting few years for that technology, and I suppose that'll get more available and more cheaper. And maybe, just maybe in a few years, maybe we'll see SLA technology start producing miniatures, home miniatures, at a price where it's actually cheap enough to put pressure on the companies to reduce prices. Maybe, maybe, it may be for companies like myself who don't have the money to immediately invest in injection molding plastic. It's quite possible that SLA technology could become an actual manufacturing source. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. I don't know. My fighter miniatures for Caladagia are produced at Shapeways. So it's certainly things like that may start to change, but once again, that's still a maybe. It's not certain. The Sls printing, at least from my opinion, I don't like that and for how it looks for gaming miniatures. So I don't know if that's going to have a huge impact on the tabletop game industry, but that particular printer, there are plenty of other industries where that thing is going to be huge. From special effects industries to anybody that does rapid prototyping, automotive industries, that's going to be huge. You may see it be used to create really cool terrain, because that bumpy texture could look really good for certain types of miniature terrain that FDM printing isn't good at. So it's not that it's gonna be, not go anywhere, but it's not gonna be super revolutionary for the tabletop game industry, in my opinion, because I don't think it offers anything new from the miniatures market and the terrain market that FDM printing doesn't already do good enough, especially at $20,000 price point. Get that thing down to $2,000, maybe, maybe you'll start seeing it be used more frequently, but there are definitely other industries that are going to love that printer. I guarantee it. So 3D printing is slowly changing the world, but it will certainly be a while. But I'll probably do this again in 2018. I don't know if I have a whole lot new to say, but maybe a year from now, so maybe September in 2018, I'll go ahead and have some fun looking into all this stuff again. Maybe I'll have a Formlabs printer making some prototypes of miniatures. Maybe, maybe not. I really don't know. But I didn't actually get to the front of Cypher's cloak today. I just kept rambling on here. And now what I'm doing is I'm blending in the wash with a little bit of the watered down thin linen white to kind of blend it in a little bit better. I actually like the effect that I'm getting. So it doesn't look quite as washy per se. It has a little bit more of a blended look inside the shadows there. I'd probably add a little bit of black in some of the very deepest recesses of the shadows and things like that. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I'll probably keep working on this. I still got to do the other parts of the cloak anyway. So maybe part 4 we'll finally get to the inside of the cloak for this guy. Maybe. Just maybe. And I need to go back and do some ridge highlighting here along the ridges of his cloak. So I got a little bit of wash up there. I've been kind of slobbering around a little bit. But I like how that looks. I'm liking the cloak, the mixture of the linen white and along with the Seraphins to be a wash. I really do like that. I think it looks pretty cool. So why don't I, to finish up the show tonight, we got about 5 minutes left here. Let me just crack out the artificial layer brush, the brand new one, and just apply a few ridges of linen white, just nice pure linen white along the top of those cloak ridges there. And that'll be what I think I'll call it done for tonight. But stay tuned for more on 3D printing. I'm definitely going to be doing a lot of 3D printing as it relates to tabletop gaming, tabletop game terrain. And I think I'm going to be having a lot of fun here pretty shortly with the Tabletop Battlefield. So I know that brands has kind of been stagnating, sitting out there, nothing really much happening for the past 7 years since Caladagia came out. Because I didn't really know what to do with it, but I've got some ideas. And hopefully by the end of the year, you're going to be seeing something kind of cool and new, instead of having 7-year-old reviews of games that don't really exist anymore. And frankly, I could care less at this point what you thought of my reviews of 7 years ago. And they probably aren't even relevant if those games exist, seeing that we've now seen Warhammer Fantasy, which I basically consider to be immortal, is now gone. It'd be a fun discussion to have is talk about licensed franchises versus original franchises and kind of see why the original franchises tend to do a little bit better than the licensed franchises overall. And I think I kind of know why, but I could talk about that. Granted, I'm a little biased towards original franchises for obvious reasons. Oops, a little too much linen white there. I'm also applying some the linen white to the very bottom to kind of help what I want to say, kind of hide the wash a little bit. But overall, I kind of like how this is looking. It's not super amazing, but it's good enough. I think it'll be fine for this. I may dirty this whole cloak up a little bit more, even using some of the nun oil just to make it really even more dirty. I mean, this guy is supposed to be 10,000 years old, right? But oh well, that's what I'm going to call it tonight. I don't have to finish. I think next time we'll finish up doing some of the washes on his front of his cloak and the side of his cloak here, and then I can start working on the inside of it and giving it the red base. Maybe this weekend I'll jump on and do some more live stream. I'm not entirely sure. Oh, let's go ahead and put that guy back on there. But as usual, tomorrow is Thursday, so 8 p.m. Eastern Time Thursday. I'm going to be doing my Caladagia live stream. For the past few times, I've been doing some 3D modeling to do 3D printing, a 3D print of the helmet back there. We're not going to keep doing that. 2 weeks in a row of that is enough. I think what I might start working on is the actual screenplay of the short film. Just kind of doing some ideas, sketching out ideas, thinking about really finalize what I want to do. Otherwise, I also need to make a new Surikari CG model for the particular short film, and I've been playing around with the sculpting features in Blender. So I've been learning how that works, and that'd be great for making a new, really cool, even better looking CG model of the Surikari warrior. Because that's probably the main CG element that's going to be in the short film. They're going to be in a few scenes and things like that. So with all that out of the way, I want to thank you guys for watching. Once again, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. You can follow me here on twitch.tv, twitch.tv/Rocker Robotics to see it live. As you can go ahead and then also get the notifications turned on. So like I said, for these Tabletop Battlefield things, I just kind of jump on whenever I feel like it. But Thursdays at 8 p.m., that is the Caladagia live stream. Of course, on YouTube, username is Rocker Robotics. You can find these videos over there if you want to watch them later on. And you can check out the past series of painting Kairos Fate Weaver, as well as building the Tau Empire Firewear cosplay helmet, which I'm pointing off camera, which is kind of useless because you can't see it over there, but I can. So but anyway, once again, thank you for watching, and have a good night.